say is please can you go and grab yourself some rough piece of paper and a pencil, because you're going to need a rough piece of paper and a pencil if you want to join in. So if you don't have one to hand, then do go grab one. Hello to everybody joining us over on Facebook. I can see lots of different people. And Marvin and Navina, welcome. That seems quite a new name. I don't remember seeing you guys join us, so welcome. And to Georgia and Rocco and Lucas, Lucy and Peter, Clem, B, Jack, Bo, Blake, lots of you, Rose. And today we are going to be looking at kind of how the English Civil War played out. So we've done quite a lot on why it happened, and kind of how Charles I really kind of angered Parliament by keep asking for money. And today what we're going to be doing is looking at kind of how it panned out. Hello also to everybody over on YouTube, everybody watching on Catch Up. Hopefully we've all had some time to grab yourself a pencil and some paper, although you won't need it quite yet. But my first challenge for you is, obviously we've looked quite a lot at the king, how he wasn't very good with money, how he wanted to tax people unfairly, how he listened to his wife quite a lot, which people didn't like because she was a Catholic and England was Protestant. We've also looked at Parliament, because Parliament wanted to have some sort of control in the running of the country. Parliament was supposed to be consulted on any tax laws, and obviously the king got fed up with Parliament, so sent them home for 11 years. So obviously we've talked quite a lot about Parliament and why they were getting so grumpy and cross. And obviously we've got the war, you know, the fact that it eventually ends in war. And we've talked about the fact that the English Civil War is a war within a civil war is a war within your own country. So it's neighbours fighting neighbours, friends fighting friends. Sometimes people within the same family chose different sides. So family fighting family. And so my very first question is, can you explain or describe what the English Civil War was in one sentence? But you're not allowed to use the word king, and you're not allowed to use the word parliament, and you're not allowed to use the word war. That's tricky. So can you sum up what the English Civil War was about without using the word king, without using the word parliament, and without using the word war? Gosh, that's quite tricky. What ideas do you have? What could you say? Now, if you're if you've got a grown up, or you're working with a friend or a sibling, you could chat amongst yourself. A conflict within a nation, that's a good one. Can you be more specific about the English Civil War, though? How would you explain the fact that it was between king and it was between parliament? So we've got what a civil war is, but we want really a bit more detail about the English Civil War. The ruler fell out with the rule makers and got in a fight with them. That's a good idea, Jack. I like that one. So it's quite tricky, isn't it? A battle for control of the country, absolutely. Charles I was a tyrant who fought democracy. I like that one. That's a really good one, because that explains what the English Civil War. A disagreement between two sides in England, which resulted in fighting and loss of life. Another really good one. The royals and the people who control money fight within their country. Our country's battle of Roundheads and Cavaliers. Some really great ones. Here's my one. So we've obviously got the king, we've got Parliament. What I went for is a conflict that happened between 1642 and 1651, where there was a series of battles between those who supported the ruler, Charles I, and those who thought he needed removing. So those that was my one, and I think lots of you used similar words, didn't you? So lots of you used conflict and ruler. So yeah, you had the same sorts of ideas as me. So we're going to start with a little quiz, and this is what you need your pencil and paper for. And you're going to decide whether or not you're A or whether or not you're B. So what kind of clothes do you like to wear? Do you like kind of quite fancy clothes? Do you like getting dressed up? Do you like them to be really colourful? You know, would you like to sort of wear, do you like wearing hats and maybe sunglasses and like fancy trainers? If you do, then you're going to choose A, and you need to write these down because you need to work out how many of each of these have you got. If you actually just fancy sort of simple practical clothes, then you're going to be a B. I'm currently sat here in my leisure wear, so I've got some jogging bottoms on and just sort of a comfy t-shirt. So I'd probably go for B. I really don't like dressing up and wearing fancy clothes. So you're going to jot down either A or B. Right. What celebrations do you enjoy? Do you like going to like really big parties? Like having really big, maybe Christmas feasts or birthday feasts or, you know, big noisy gatherings? If you do, then you're going to go for A. Or do you like quiet gatherings, kind of simple foods? You know, maybe staying at home with just a few people, having something nice to eat, and, you know, just sort of chilling. So that's another one. What sort of celebrations do you enjoy? Now, what sort of leader would you prefer? So think about, you know, the time of the English Civil War. Would you like a leader that's like a noble person? They've got noble blood. They've been chosen by God. Remember, that's what people believed in the time of the English Civil War, that Charles I has been chosen by God. Or would you just rather just some sort of normal person like you or I who's been voted in? What do you reckon you choose? Do you think, you know, you choose the noble that's been chosen by God? That surely sounds quite an important person to be ruling the country. Or just like just a normal person, like, you know, me and you, been voted in, someone you choose. So you're going to go for A or you're going to go for B. I hope you're writing all these down because we're going to count out up at the end how many have got A's and how many B's you've got. Joe reckons that B is far more fair. It absolutely is. Right. What job would suit you better? If you were going to war in the English Civil War, would you rather have a horse and be part of the cavalry? So the cavalry are the ones that get on horses and they like charge at the enemy. So do you think, you know, you'd quite like to get on a horse and be part of the cavalry? Or do you think you'd just rather be a foot soldier? You know, it's too much to handle, like trying to ride a horse and wield a weapon. You know, would you just rather sort of chance it out as a foot soldier? What do you reckon? I think probably I'd go for the foot soldier. Right, what sounds better? So would you like to live in a large mansion? Would you like lots of money? Would you like having your friends around all the time with like really posh food to eat? Or would you rather just like live quite simply and, you know, live in the country, have a strong community around you with sort of clear rules, but, you know, just a simpler life? Yeah, Bo, I agree. I wouldn't want to harm the horse either. So what would you rather? Like a big mansion with loads of money and mates coming around with lots of food to eat, or would you rather like a simple life? I definitely would rather a simple life, I think. You can still have friends with B. You've got a strong community, but like a small community. It's not like, you know, you wouldn't have friends, but like A is like, you know, you have your friends around all the time. Like I have lots of friends, but I don't want them around my house all the time. I like to get, you know, snuggled up in a blanket and read a book of an evening. I certainly wouldn't want a massive party in my house. Right, what sounds more fun? Parties, jousting, dancing, and fancy entertainment, or debates, quiet dinners, and reading? What do you reckon? So parties and jousting and dancing, a bit of fancy entertainment, or debates, quiet dinners, and reading. Now, I quite like a debate. I do like a big argument, but surely we're all going to go for fancy entertainment and jousting. That does, as long as I don't have to host it, I do think that sounds pretty cool. I think lots of you think A as well. Right, so you're going to count up how many A's you have and how many B's you have. Now, if you have more A's, then the result is that you would likely be somebody who would support King Charles the First. If, though, you got mostly B's, you are likely, this is a picture of Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell was known as a Puritan. And Puritans, it was a type of Christianity, but Puritans believed that we should lead far more simpler lives, simpler, plainer lives, and that we should do good and that we shouldn't be obsessed with money and lavish things. And he was the leader of the opposition. So the sort of, he is the one that got together all of Parliament and all of the people that thought that Charles I was needing to be removed. So the B's, if you got more B's, you're likely to have supported Parliament and Oliver Cromwell. However, that said, it was just a bit of fun. Because just because you like parties, you might ultimately have a huge problem with a king that rules a country, wastes their money and taxes people illegally. So it was just really a little bit of fun. And what I want you to think of is, if you were living in this time, what would you really use to make up your mind on who to support? Because this is a humongous period of history. The country is going to war. In your family, you would have to decide, well, who are you going to support? Are you going to support Charles, or are you going to support Parliament? Who would you choose? And so, what would you really use to make up your mind? Well, you wouldn't do a fun quiz that Chrissy's made up. You would use lots of things. Some of the things you'd use is what your overall morals and beliefs are. So we all have our own morals and our own beliefs. So if you were a really strict Christian and you believe that Charles I was chosen by God, on that alone, on a kind of religious perspective, if you were using religion, you might just go, do you know what? It doesn't really matter what he's doing. We need to support Charles I. But what else might you consider with regards to who's to support? Now, your social class would make a huge difference to who you are likely to support. So if you were very, very wealthy, very, very rich, and money was not really much of a problem for you, you were part of the upper classes, then you would probably more likely to support Charles I. Whereas if you were kind of normal working class people, then you're probably likely to support Parliament. Tradition as well, so kind of your traditional views. If you believed, and we have this today, like people's sort of traditions and beliefs. Some people would have continued to support the king just because that's what they'd always had. And it's like a tradition. And we still keep our royal family. Our royal family don't have any power today, but we still keep them. And we keep them because we like tradition. You might also, though, if you're quite an ambitious person, you might see it as an opportunity to get on in life. Well, maybe if I support the king and the king wins, I might get like a really nice reward. Or maybe if I support Parliament and Parliament wins, maybe I might get something out of it. So ambition is something that is a big thing. Money. So who you could maybe, where you would think quite often when people are voting for who they want to rule a country, they're thinking about which ruler is going to make sure I have as much money in my pocket as possible. So that's another thing. Feelings about change. Lots of people really don't like change. They're really worried about change. They're really nervous about change. They just don't like change. They like the status quo. They like things to stay as they are. So that's perfectly normal. If you don't really like change, you're likely to support Charles. But if you're someone on the opposite of that, you like things to keep changing, get things to be a bit more exciting, then you probably would likely support Parliament. Family ties as well. Near to us is a stately home, and their whole family, famously during the English Civil War, their whole family broke apart because the dad supported Charles, but the son supported Parliament. And the dad was like, you know what, you have to support Charles. Family ties, that means something. But actually, in this case, the son was like, no, I'm going to go and fight for Parliament. And it actually broke up the family. They were known as the St. John family. Safety. So you might be sort of thinking, what's going to be the safest, what's going to keep me safe? So if you live in an area that's likely to be supporting, so different areas of the country tended to support different sides. So if your whole town or village, if most of them are supporting, say, Parliament, might not be that safe to start saying, well, I actually think I support the king. And also, as we've said, your religious beliefs. So the two sides are a little bit like this. We have the Cavaliers. So if you are a Cavalier, you are a supporter of King Charles I. So we tend to call them the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers, people that support King Charles, tend to support him because they also believed in this divine right of kings, that the king was chosen by God. And they were usually, but not always, they were usually from noble or wealthy families. And then you have the parliamentarians. Now, they're sometimes called the Roundheads. It's to do with that type of helmet that they have on. But parliamentarians were supporters of Parliament. And really, they fought for wanting to share power. And many of them, like Oliver Cromwell, were Puritans, which were basically very strict Christians. And so these are the two sides. So who would you have supported? And why? Would you have supported the Cavaliers, or would you have supported the parliamentarians? So forget the quiz. Think about your family ties, your belief system, whether you like change or whether you don't like change. Who do you think you would have supported and why? And if you want some extra research to do after the lesson, go and find out if you live in England, obviously lots of you don't, but if you do live in England or you know somebody who lives in England, go and find out traditionally who supported, your area, who they supported. So the area that I live in was very, very strongly parliamentarian. So where I live, there were, it was tradition to support the parliamentarians. Right, so lots of you saying you would definitely have supported the parliamentarians. So yeah, I think some of you are saying you would have supported the Cavaliers. Yeah, so lots of parliamentarians were strict Puritans. Jack's made a point. Puritans often didn't believe we should have like big lavish Christmases. So yeah, if you like those lavish parties, then probably the Cavaliers is your best bet. Yeah, the parliamentarians, because we don't want to pay lots of tax. Absolutely. Blake would support the Cavaliers. Yeah, the Roundheads. There's quite a mixed bag, actually. So yeah, lots of different views. There's something to be said to support the Cavaliers. Some people don't like change. And also, you kind of know that eventually Charles I is going to die, and maybe, the next king will be a bit better. Don't forget, in history, there had been some pretty bad kings and queens beforehand. It wasn't like he was the first, so you could just argue, well, we'll just, maybe we'll just sort of weather it out a little bit. So my next thing, this is why I needed another reason for your paper and pencil, a nice, fun but quick activity. If you had to design a logo or a symbol for your side, what would it be? Because when we did the War of the Roses, they obviously had their own logos or symbols, didn't they? So the House of York had theirs, the House of Lancaster had theirs. There aren't really any symbols for the Cavaliers and the Parliamentarians. So if you had to design a logo or symbol, what would it be? So you could either describe it in the chat, or you could have a little go on a rough piece of paper, having a draw and having a go at drawing your symbol. So what would it be? It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think the Cavaliers, a good one, would be maybe like a sunshine with like beams coming out, because sometimes, you know, when you think about God, people sort of often, you know, that la out of the sky, so you could have that for the Cavaliers. So our town supported the Parliamentarians, but they're captured by the Royalists, and then they fought back to support the Parliamentarians again. Amazing. So yeah, so what logo would you have for your side? The Parliamentarians. You could almost have an outline maybe of the Houses of Parliament for your symbol, but that's maybe a bit boring. Or you could have like the justice, you know, those scales that sort of represent justice. You could have the Parliamentarian symbol, could be that one. But yeah, what ideas do you have? We're just designing or thinking about what we would design as a symbol or a logo for the side that you would support. So Jack would have a Christmas tree to represent the Cavaliers. Don't forget, though, they wouldn't necessarily have known that the Parliamentarians and Oliver Cromwell, you know, you're using hindsight there a little bit. We wouldn't have known that Oliver Cromwell was so against the extravagance of Christmas. But yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, there's lots of ideas, but you could definitely have a go at this after the session if you want some more time. This is the next one to think about as well. What slogan or motto would your side shout in battle? Now, a really obvious one for the Cavaliers is "Long live the King." But that's a bit boring. It needs to be polite-ish. I mean, you can't start sort of shouting rude things at the opposition. Oh, that's a nice one. A daisy for the Cavaliers, as my spaniel is called Daisy. That's a nice one. Has anybody else got because a Cavalier King Charles is named after this monarch. A big round head for Parliament. That's a pretty cool one. So I think for Parliamentarians, I'd be shouting out, vote, not... What could you have? Votes, not birth, because obviously they're born a king. So I probably would shout something like votes, not birth. Or we want to say, and we don't want taxes. Although that's not very catchy, is it? The Cavaliers, you know, he's chosen by God. That would be a good one. Or we like fancy things. So there's lots of ideas of different slogans. So the Roundheads could shout, "You've got small brains," to the Cavaliers. That's a good one. A bit rude, but you know, might upset them as you're running. Yeah, well, lots to think about, isn't it? Now, here we've got their uniforms and what they kind of look like. So one of these people are wearing a helmet with a "To freedom from the monarch." I like that one, B. We must fight for our people. There's some lovely ones coming up as you're thinking. While you're having a think, we've got some different labels here. So one of these individuals is wearing a lobster-tailed pot helmet. So basically it has a lobster tail on the back of it to protect your neck. One of them has short straight hair. One of them has a functional uniform. One of them has a wide brimmed hat with a feather because it looks rather smashingly fashionable. One has a doublet with a red sash because red marks loyalty to the king. One has a sword and a flintlock pistol because they're very wealthy and can afford all these weapons. And somebody has a blue sash on, indicating support for Parliament. Down with the monarchy, says Ollie. Yeah, that's a good one. So who's wearing who? So on the left, obviously, we have the Cavaliers, the ones fighting for the king. And on the right, we have the Roundheads, or the parliamentarians. So Lucy has decided that Parliament would be a scroll there with a lightning bolt through it, which is a very good symbol. That's quite a cool symbol. I like that too. I like that a lot. Which uniform would you rather be in, I suppose? That's the other thing. Neither of them look like they're going to give you great protection, do they, from like a very sharp sword? Oh, Holly, that's a good one. Where does the word cavalier come from? Do you know what? I know lots of you know I like that I'm very interested in the origin of words. Obviously, it's got to be linked with cavalry, hasn't it? If I was going to take an educated guess, I would argue that it is probably because the king had a lot of cavalry. Because obviously, if you own a horse, you're wealthy, and so therefore, the supporters of the king, the army that supported the king, had a huge cavalry. So possibly cavalier came from there. If you talk about someone having like being very cavalier in their outlook, so it's actually that can also be used as an adjective, cavalier, or he's very cavalier today. It kind of means somebody that's very kind of brave and sort of quite, but also sort of quite suave and sort of quite, yeah, sort of quite brave and sort of, but also looks quite, you know, suave and well dressed. So could have come from that. I don't know is the answer. It's a great answer, a great question. I love it when young people make me think. I will find out. Yeah, it does, but whether that's the reason. So yeah, Clem being Connie says, Dad says it means horseman. So if you're a member of the cavalry and the cavalry charge, it means that you're on horseback. And so yeah, it's it could have come from that, but it also from the French word chevalier. Really bad pronunciation. But yeah, it's probably from the cavalry. But I will look it up to be sure. So this is, you can see that the Cavaliers do have more, in some ways, more weaponry because they're from richer families in general. So the Cavaliers tended to be, the supporters of the king tended to be more wealthy. So their outfits tended to be decorative. It symbolised their wealth. These wide-brimmed hats with feathers, swords and flintlock pistols, because they could afford these weapons, and this red sash marking loyalty to the king. Sometimes it's known as the New Model Army, but obviously the king commands the army. So as soon as we enter into war, the king actually has an army, whereas the parliamentarians don't. So Oliver Cromwell produces an army. It's known as the New Model Army. They have a very functional uniform with this lobster-tailed pot helmet, which gives them quite a lot of protection. And often they have short, straight hair because they reject long hair as being vain. They like things that are far more simple. Did they eat caviar? Probably, because they were often quite wealthy. So Lucy would design a logo of the Cavaliers as a crown with some money. Did they have guns in that time? Absolutely. So they have, you can see it on this chap here. He's holding it in his right hand. This is a flintlock pistol. Now, the thing to say about a flintlock pistol is, and you often see them in museums, but a flintlock pistol, you put like a ball bearing in, so like a hard ball that that is obviously round, and you put that into the bottom, a little bit like a mini cannonball, and you put that into the bottom of your flintlock pistol, and then you ram down a tiny bit of cloth, gunpowder wrapped in a cloth, and then you light it at the end that you pull the trigger. So you basically have, it's called match. This is totally digressing, but it's called match, which is basically like a burning, smouldering, like piece of cloth, almost like twisted, bit like if you've got an oil lamp, it looks a little bit like that. It's like a long smouldering wick, and then you put some gunpowder on the outside of the barrel, and then when you pull the trigger, the smoking match, which is this like cloth, lands on the gunpowder, which then lights the gunpowder inside the barrel, and then out shoots the ball, which is literally looks like a cannonball. But the thing about it is they're very slow to load, and also the ball, as it's coming out of the barrel, sort of knocks a little bit because it's not a tight fit, and so they're not very direct. So whenever you hear about people having like pistols at dawn and there being a duel, and you think, well, that's a bit ridiculous because you're both going to end up dead, it's actually because flintlock pistols don't really fire very straight. So you could have somebody like running straight for you. You could aim at their head, and it actually just like skims slightly past their ear because they're not particularly accurate. So they did have guns in those days, but they were very, very slow and not very accurate, and they didn't fire very fast. So for me, I would choose probably still a sword. Now, you know that I'm quite a big believer in things that are stereotypical. So you know I don't like, for example, history books that tell you that all mummies were mummified by removing the brain. Well, it's a little bit stereotypical when you look at things to do with the English Civil War. These two sides, it's very stereotypical to say that the Roundheads look like this and the Cavaliers look like this. And the idea that, you know, you could rock up to a battle and they could all just be intermingling, and you could go, right, everybody get in a nice line. And you could go, right, you're a Cavalier because you've got a fancy hat. And you're a Roundhead because you've got short hair. And you are a Cavalier because you've got a pistol and a horse. And you're a Roundhead because you've got a pot helmet. Actually, it's all a bit nonsense. Both sides, if you rocked up to a battle in the English Civil War, both sides wore similar clothes and armour, especially at the start of the war. So if you turned up, we could go back in history and look at a battle. Probably you wouldn't know which side is which. Don't forget, there were no official uniforms at this time. So soldiers wore what they could afford or what they were given. So there was no standard look. So when we look at the soldiers today, everybody's wearing exactly the same. Whereas soldiers wore what they could afford. And really, this idea that, you know, Cavaliers had this long, fancy hair because they were all extravagant and rich, and Roundheads had really short hair, it's a bit silly, because some Roundheads might have liked long hair, and some Cavaliers might have hated long hair and wanted short hair. So this idea that you could split the sides based on their hair is also nonsense. And also, you could be wealthy and rich and look fancy and still think that Parliament was the side to choose, and you could look plain and live a simple life and still believe that the king was who you should support. And so where we look at these stereotypes, they're all true, it's not a true false. When we look at these stereotypes, so if you've got a history books at home, go and do this for me. Open up or go to the library and look. When you open up the English Civil War, you will see this is what the Cavaliers look like, and this is what the Roundheads look like. And if you were actually at school and you were in year 8 and you were doing the English Civil War, I bet you your teacher would give you a Cavalier to label and give you a Roundhead to label. And for me, it drives me slightly mad because it's a pile of nonsense. And it comes from the Victorian era, which quite a lot of things do. This idea of this dashing Cavalier with his long curly hair and his fancy hat with a feather, and then these boring Roundheads with their short hair and their drab clothes. and their Puritan ideas. That comes from the Victorian era, because they like to tell dramatic stories. And really, real life is messy, isn't it? During the English Civil War, families were split, which I've told you. People changed sides. The people that started fighting for the king and then gone, hang on a minute, it looks like he might lose, I'm going to swap sides. So this idea that these are what they look like is actually nonsense. So you can take on what I'm saying and go and sort of change history, because I really dislike stereotypical history being given to young people. But go and check out those textbooks, because I'm telling you, they'll say this is a cavalier and this is a roundhead or a parliamentarian, and it's basically a Victorian idea. If we could go back in time and turn up at a battle site, they would all probably look pretty similar. And there'll be roundheads with long hair, and there'll be cavaliers with short hair, and there'll be some parliamentarians wearing fancy clothes, and there'll be some cavaliers wearing plain clothes. So it's all a bit silly and all a bit stereotypical. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to finish off. I'm going to come back to those two slides because I think I've talked a little bit too much. So we'll start next week with those two slides, because I've been going for nearly 40 minutes already. But one thing I thought was going to be really fun this week was to talk to Charles I, or pretend to talk to Charles I. So if you don't already know, you can head over to the Twinkle website, and we have an AI tool which allows you to talk to somebody in the past. Obviously not really, but just pretend. But it is quite cool. So I, this week, decided that I would go on to, it's called ARI, A-R-I. And if you click on ARI, it will take you to, you click on the talk to a historical character. And so the first thing I asked Charles I was, do you like Oliver Cromwell? And it was quite a diplomatic answer. He said that him and Oliver Cromwell don't see eye to eye. And that Oliver Cromwell doesn't agree with his views on ruling the country, and that basically they were more like rivals than friends. So it's quite diplomatic. And then I thought that I would be a bit unkind, and so I asked Charles I, on reflection, do you think that you were a bit of a rubbish king? And interestingly, he answers that his rule was very challenging, and that he made lots of decisions that not everyone agreed with, and that he should have made wiser choices and talk more cooperatively with Parliament, but that he tried his best. Well, Charles I, your best wasn't good enough, because you led us to an English civil war. So if you fancy a bit of fun, then do go and chat to Charles I over on the Twinkle website. You're looking for ARI at the top. And what we're going to finish is, so based on what we've done today, we've looked at the two sides, that we end up with these two sides. Charles with believing the divine right of kings and he can do what he wants, Parliament wanting to stop it, then going to war, and the two sides fighting, and it split up families and people change sides. What headline would you choose to sum up the war? So mine would be, Charles I is silly, he should have listened. Where do you find it? So if you look at the top, there's like lots of different tabs, and one of them says ARI tool, A-R-I tool. Or if you just type in ARI into the search function, it should come up. And then it says one of the options is talk to a historical figure. So what headline would you choose to sum up the war? I would go for Charles is silly, he led us to war. What do we think? What headline would you choose? So I'm going to leave you to think on that one. The last thing to say is, don't forget to check the Time Explorer's English Civil War blog, because it's been up updated this week with more great activities. So I've got, because there's a little bit of delay on the chat, so I've got some coming in. Silly Charles led us to war. Yeah, absolutely, that would be a good one. It's all Charles's fault. That would be quite a good one. Charles did not make the right decisions. That's another good one. Yeah, have a little think of some really cool. Sting for the King. I love it. Yeah, it's got to be like a kind of clickable, like a clickable headline. Charles is dumb, harsh, probably a bit true. Yeah, lots of good ideas. Keep going with your unblock your ears, Charles, and listen. So yeah, lots of cool ones coming. King is a bad king. That's quite a cool one as well. So do go and check out the blog. There's some great activities that I've put up there this week. I will see you next week, where we're going to look at kind of what happened, particularly what happened to poor Charles I. If you don't know, it doesn't end well for him. Have a lovely week. If you're joining me tomorrow for animation, do go and check out the animation blog as well, because there's a resource you're going to need to print out for tomorrow. But if I don't see you tomorrow for animation, then I will see you next week, where we find out what happens to poor Charles I. Have a lovely week, and I'll see you soon.